my approach typically is when there's two phrases that are exactly the same, I want to change them up just slightly. Dum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba dee dum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba da. So I would do the second one just a little bit softer. But that's, you know, either way is fine. I think what you'd be looking for as a judge is that you had some consistency in the approach. You know, whatever you establish sort of is, this is what I'm doing. You'd want to hear it repeated in those parts that where it really is kind of the call and answer. Where you would expect the same rhythmic presentation.
The phrase I use for reels is, I agree with what you're saying, is to space it up and down. It's like a bouncing ball or a Highland dancer.
Mm-hmm.
And a reel is more horizontal. I tell the pupils that it's driving. We want to keep driving.
Mm-hmm.
So to make that driving, I would hold these A's. Driving, but you control it as well. But
Mm-hmm.
That's a good phrase to make it. Just space it up and down and reels it.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you get to the fourth part, though, rhythmically the first part is the same. Now, would you hold the low A and sort of
This.
Yeah, grace over all the high A's and high G's right there to get to the next E and hold that as well, like you know.
Yeah.
Or would you, just because musically the tune isn't repetitive like the first part, but instead of holding both beat notes, you know, maybe just the downbeats there?
Well, I think you could probably do it, you know, either way. It would be subtle, you know, one way or the other. What you're saying is, would you pull this E as long as you, the same length as the low A?
As opposed to the high A in beat 2? Lauren was talking about having an emphasis on beat 1 and 2 in the first part.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Just because the musical phrase is different, would you just hold maybe the downbeat instead?
I think you'd hold beat 1, downbeat 1, mm-hmm. and not so much downbeat 2. I mean, it's kind of a different. Whereas in the first part, you know, dum ba dum ba dum ba dum. I think the reason that you're really pulling that second low A is that it's like a 1-2 punch, you know, bum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba dum bum ba, you know. But here it's hum ba dee da dee da 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 dee da dee. At least, you know, again, I hear all this kind of connected together in my own mind, whereas I understand, you know, the kind of the 1-2 punch there.
This tune lends itself to heavy parts and light parts. You do the driving part, and you get a bit of relief in the next part where it's light,
mm-hmm.
light and shade. So the third part would dum dee ba dee dum ba dee ba dee, really heavy.
Yeah.
And then you go into the next one, it's dum ba dee ba dee ba dum ba da, and you show the subtleties. So they're not all heavy. You get heavy parts and light parts, I think.
That's a good point. So maybe in the heavy parts, we do really go more for emphasize that beat, emphasize that beat, emphasize that beat, whereas in the lighter parts, smooth it out a bit. Hum ba dee da dee da da dum ba dee da dee da 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 da.
That's like playing this tune is almost like that, isn't it? It's playing with it.
Yeah.
Heavy parts and light parts.
Yeah. So, circling back.
There's a real consistency thing for reels then. It's a lot of the whole notes are based on the musical score of the tune. You know, each tune would have a different sort of way that people would look for whole notes and all that. Is it safe to say that obviously every tune could have a different sort of emphasis as long as it's driving forward, like you say?
Yeah.
It's easy to generalize, but no, there are subtleties in all these tunes.
So, for those that are watching this presentation that have yet to take the exam or go through the development, the exam does provide, you know, one part of music, and you are asked to show the phrasing and the introductory notes, and then also describe how you would get musicality out of the tune. So all of these sorts of things, so the call and answer, the beat, off beat, dot cut, and then little, just little subtle things about sort of changing things up a bit, like we talked about the difference between the heavier parts and the lighter parts. That kind of description is what's asked for. All right. Well, we've talked about some of these items. What are the priorities? On the exam, you are asked to provide your opinion about how do you approach certain situations, and overall, how do you approach these issues of what's more important? Is it tone? Is it certain aspects of tone? Is it basic, articulation of movements? Is it some understanding of musicality? Is it some combination of those things? And you get some different opinions. I just, in this presentation, I wrote down what my opinions were. I've talked to other judges that say, well, at the lowest grades, what I want to listen for is, is there, the most important thing is, do they understand bagpipe music? That there's an understanding of what a 2/4 is supposed to sound like versus, well, at the lower grades they're playing 2/4 versus a slow air, or maybe even a 6/8. And then you talk to others that say, no, bottom line is, if somebody's playing the bagpipes, the first thing that they've got to get a hold of is tone. They've got to be able to create a sound. I think you can, talk about any of those things being priorities, and the end result probably is that all of those elements really make up, the expectations in all of the grade levels. But then it gets to, so what really becomes a differentiator? All things being equal, what are you expecting to be the differentiator at the different grade levels? So I'd like to know what your thoughts are too, as far as how you approach judging a grade 4 competition versus up to a grade 1 or open class competition. You have kind of a mindset, or what do we call it? A rubric that you use when you're approaching competitions.
I favor on the tone side.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the grade 4, I think it's a big thing, because nowadays, with the advancement of drone reeds and bags and everything else, I think there's no excuse for a poor instrument anymore. You've got a much better chance than we had.
Yeah.
When we were younger, fiddling with cane drone reeds and fighting everything else. So when you get a grade 4 that comes up doing a slow air, there's really not much music there. Especially some of them that play very simplified.
Yeah.
So I would give the edge to someone that has a nicer pipe and more control of the instrument.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my edge.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm more of a tone guy. I just like,
Mm-hmm.
I like the favor of that. I wouldn't take away, like you say, if someone was not as good tone-wise and everything else was good. But I don't know, in the back of my mind, I still favor someone that has a better understanding of the instrument.
Of the instrument, yeah. I could definitely see that, especially in a slow air competition where technique hopefully is not going to differentiate. I mean, there's just not.
And then as you progress through the grades, of course, you expect more.
Mm-hmm.
You get an MSR, you expect to know the knowledge of everything.
Yeah.
Each idiom, the way it goes, plus a good instrument.
Yeah.
And then there, most of the time, the contest there, what usually separates 1 and 2 are mental mistakes, or a semi-break down the middle of the part, or whatever. They've all got a good instrument, usually. So you're looking for them to make the mistake to lose the prize.
Mm-hmm.
More on their own. And your job is just to pick the one that's there.
Yeah.
It all boils down to everyone's own opinion. What you want to favor.
Any other thoughts?
Campbell said
Yes.
something earlier about the triad of tone, technique, and music.
Uh-huh.
All three of those are in that breakdown on what's most important. So maybe they develop at different rates. Because you got technique, tone,
Yeah.
music all there.
Yeah. So I think so. What Charlie was saying, this would be an approach kind of based upon what the sort of the classic idea of when when you're learning on a chanter, you're learning technique. You got to get the fingering down, and if you're doing something wrong, that's not good because it needs to be corrected, right? And tone was a harder thing to kind of get to, whereas what Charlie was saying is that, well, tone now with the way that pipes are set up, it's a little bit easier to achieve that. Maybe grade 4 players achieve that a little bit earlier, and so you could
It's far
bias
more
towards that.
improved now than it used to be.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Yeah,
Some of what you used to hear was terrible.
yeah, including bands too.
Yeah.
Same thing. It's when I hear a grade 4 competitor, and they have pretty good tone, pretty good technique, and they end up with really excellent musicality. Like it's like, oh, this person really understands what they're doing. I mean, that just kind of blows me away. And oftentimes, even at a grade 4 level, somebody that can show a refined understanding of musicality, that sort of puts them up in my mind. So these three things, and these priorities aren't meant to be an absolute necessarily, but they tend to be where I think there will be more differentiation, and I'll probably I'll pay a little bit more time, a little bit more attention to these elements in these different grades.
Yeah, I think for the test that for the adjudicator taking the test, you've got to be able to present some sort of a rationale.
Yeah.
From low grade to high grade, and consider technique and sound and music, and then talk about it in some sort of coherent way.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense. And so I think that's what the evaluator, whoever that may be, is going to be considering.
Yeah.
And then, like we already spoke about, in terms of, like, for instance, tone, if you talk about tone, maybe in the grade 4, for me anyway, I think it's more about intonation rather than tone. In other words, are they really blowing whatever they've got? Usually the good pipe is set up by somebody else. So I'm wary at a low grade that I'm judging it on the sound of the pipe when it's the evaluation of the player and that I'm trying to do. That has an effect. Although I appreciate what Charlie says in terms of a slow air. Listening to a slow air with a bad pipe is pretty rough.
Yeah.
And how do you get good intonation on
Yeah.
a poorly set up pipe? I don't know. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. It's steady, but it's off.
Yeah.
Steadily off, and it's a strange idea. Rather than being it's off to begin with, and you're blowing it off, you're making it worse by going too strong and too weak.
Yeah.
But I guess for the test itself, which is what we're trying to prepare for, is you should be able to try to present a coherent argument about what your philosophy is. And so, that's all you have to do.
Yeah, and the whole point of this development program is not to have a bunch of judges who judge things exactly the same way. As much as a competitor that's going around to the different events would, it would be nice to have, sort of the, you play something a certain way and you do it the same each time and you're going to get the same result, maybe. But we're not doing a cookie cutter thing. We are wanting judges to take those personal preferences and be able to factor those into a consistent approach for them. And then part of this conversation that goes on helps to, I understand what Charlie was saying about slow air. That may get me thinking, well, at grade 4 level in slow airs, that may be where I want to hear a little bit more, I may put a little bit more emphasis on tone because, that may be sort of a dominant sort of thing that comes out in a grade 4 slow air is tone. So that's good. Lauren?
You basically have to justify your reasoning, isn't it? It's not why you decided it is. I mean, you have to be able to explain it to any people who's up to you. People will always come up and ask.
Yeah.
So as long as you can justify how you reached that decision, I think that's the important thing.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about some of these points of contention, you know, things that happen. Again, as part of the exam, you're asked to express some opinion about how you, as a judge, would treat some of these sorts of situations, whether it's something having to do with the pipes, something having to do with choking, bloking. That's a new one, or bloking. A drone stopping. Supposed to play with 3 drones, and the middle tenor goes, you know, or in a grade 4 contest, you know, you kind of listen, you go, there's only a tenor and a bass there. You know, how do you treat that? And do you treat it differently at a grade 4 level versus grade 1 or open? And then even things like distractions. What if there's a clap of thunder and lightning and somebody, you know is, yeah, the Gatling gun, right. The Camerons are around and the Gatling gun goes off. You know, what do you do?
We got together and went over all the rules for a Napa, but we were trying not to make them identical, but make them consistent. So that would be an inconsistency. Maybe bass drone going off or something like that. Maybe it's just the bass. I don't know.
I certainly couldn't give the guy first prize.
Yeah.
I still have to give him the prize.
Well, what if there are 2 other competitors and one of them forgets a part, and then the third one can't play a burl to save his life? I mean, you know, are any one of those, you know, absolute showstoppers? And if they are, you know, are you sure? Because it, you know, so if there is a rule in this other association that says if a drone stops, you're out. There's no prize awarded. If you know, if you disqualify everybody. Yeah. I don't know. I know you get different opinions. Some people will say, absolutely, drone stops. You know, you're not playing on the Great Highland Bagpipe then. So.
Sitting towards the end or something.
Yeah.
And the distraction point, I thought long and hard about that as well. I came to the conclusion, if there was only one kid got the cannon me off, I might let him restart. But if everybody had to deal with it, then sorry, no.
Yeah.
It's, you know.
So if the distraction is the same for everybody, or at least similar for everybody, then you'd say, no, that's just part of the competition.
One guy got it, then you might give him a chance.
There's one competitor that an acquaintance of mine who was playing at Glenfinnan, and if you've played there, it's this beautiful setting, out by the the monument to the Jacobites, and the platform is there right on the side of the loch, and the judges are there, and sometimes it's a little breezy, sometimes it's pouring rain, but all the time it's beautiful scenery, and you have tourists come and visit as well during the competition, and this person was playing a pibroch up on the platform and playing along, and these 2 ladies, Italian tourists, came up and stood right next to him, and they were taking each other's pictures, and he went off the tune, and the judges said, sorry. Yeah. It's one of the hazards of Glenfinnan, I guess. Yeah. So this last bullet is just kind of really a throwaway. I mean, you know, it comes down to your overall impression. Whatever the priorities, the things that go on, you still make a call, and there is not one formula that you use to make that call. But you do want to be, as consistent as possible, for your own judging, and also from competition to competition. I mean, you don't show up at the one games and say, I think I'm gonna only listen to execution. I'm not going to pay attention to musicality. Obviously you don't do that. So and you want to make sure that you're always thinking about it and challenging yourself as far as, how you would deal with different situations. When you're filling out the adjudication sheet, obviously one of the things that you're doing is you're picking, first through sixth place, that sort of thing. But the feedback that you're giving, you want to make sure that it addresses all these elements on technique, musicality, on tone. Tempos is part of musicality, but the various elements that have gone into how you have listened to the performance and what you consider important in the performance. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We're there not to berate people. Everybody does this as a hobby. Very few as a profession. Some do, but especially for the vast majority of pipers that are coming up and trying to improve, that sarcastic or discouraging remarks are just the total opposite of the sort of things that we want to put on a score sheet. You don't want to insult anybody's teachers either. So it's good to stick with the facts, stick with your own opinions about things and generate it that way. The amateur type player, it's good to, if there's at least one thing, even in a performance that's not very good, one thing that you can point out that maybe is a positive, overall, have some type of congratulatory comment. Now, if somebody breaks down and or it's just a real disaster, it's kind of hard to say, well, you looked really good, or something like that. But even something like, what a shame, better luck next time, look forward to hearing that again, in its entirety. I had one situation where I was at a total loss as to what to say. It was at the Mount Tam games, and it was just really windy. And this one competitor was up, and it was their first competition. And the pipes were a bit hard, and it was windy. Their mouth was getting dry. It was hard for them to blow. And they were playing, I think it was Captain Norman or Ewing or something like that. The first part worked out okay, and actually they weren't marching. So they kind of were sort of faced away from the wind and trying to maintain. First part went okay, and then choke and choke and choke. And by the time they were into the third part, there was probably as much silence as there was note from the chanter. And then it got even worse, but they were still fingering along. So I didn't quite know what to say, but they actually kind of found it, even though it was sort of a difficult situation for them, they found it kind of amusing. And I think I wrote something like something like, I look forward to hearing you play this again in its entirety, a little happy face, kind of ha-ha. But I couldn't judge them, because all I heard was drones and then a chanter sound every once in a while. So there really wasn't anything I could tell them about technique or their tuning or anything like that. So sometimes you'll have situations where it's just just try to be nice and move on. On one of the handouts, the one that starts out with the how much theory, about halfway through, there's a couple of pages that says judging solo piping, and it talks about prerequisites and skills. So some of these areas that prerequisites, and also we look for actually in qualifying judges to be on the panel, that you do have a certain playing skill, performance experience. Certainly repertoire is something that every single one of us can always improve upon. expanding our repertoire, always challenging yourself. Teaching experience is certainly comes in handy. It's not a total overlap with judging. Not all teachers are good judges. Not all judges are good teachers necessarily, but I think there's a pretty good overlap there, that those that are pretty good at teaching can also be pretty good at judging. It may not be their preference to judge. I've spoken with some who say, I love teaching, but I just don't like ranking, saying you won and you took second and you took third. So, I mean, that's something that you also have to be decisive and be sure about your conclusions. So some of these other things that we have talked about this morning, additional skills to work on, constructive comments. One skill that I continue to try and work on is taking notes while still listening. So, how do I want to kind of take a note as the tunes are going along, making notes of either mistakes or good parts or some observations, and yet still listening? Because as much as we like to think we can dual task, it's really hard. It's really hard to write, especially complete sentences, as we are listening. But it's something that, as a judge, you want to be able to at least take enough notes to know what you're referring to, and then at the end of the performance go back and maybe fill in some of the details. Having expectations and matching your comments appropriate to the grade. You can be a little bit more blunt with the grade 2, grade 1, and open competitors as far as not only sort of what happened, but also your own opinions about things. And typically, those competitors are experienced enough that they're not going to take it personally. As long as you're not insulting about it. And putting the performer at ease. Again, especially lower grades. I think it's all part of the experience of getting better. And then there are some other advice. There's some other advice here on the second page about some of the tricks to sorting through larger fields, keeping track of some of your observations. I use a little bit of a cheat sheet. I have a little book that I carry with me. I write down the name of the competitor, and it might even be an abbreviation, and the tune that they played. And then I have 3 columns: tone, technique, and music. And tone, very broadly speaking. At the end of the performance, I'll put either a 0, meaning sort of the middle of what I would expect for that grade, a minus, meaning it's kind of below what I expect, and a plus if it's better than what I expected. And then I use that as a way to, as I'm ordering the sheets in the order that I have decided they're going to be ranked, I use that to double check. Sometimes if things are quite close to competitors, then I'll look and see, well, you know what, in this particular grade, let's say it's grade 1, where I felt that musicality is going to be a differentiating factor. If I had a plus for one person in musicality and a 0 for the other person, or some distinction there, then I'll think about, well, what I'm saying from my notes is that one competitor had the better musical interpretation, so I'm going to give the advantage to them. So it's just, for me, it's a way of kind of sorting through, especially a large contest. If you have 15 competitors, it helps to sort through.
What are tricks of the old pros?
We can't let on to that.
You're still a competitor, so you don't want to give those away.
Right.
Other guy tunes his middle drone that's not really working,
Yeah. What are some of the old tricks of the old pros? pibroch high G. You know, if you have if your pibroch high G isn't tuned well enough, you know, you can maybe turn away from the judge when you're playing a high G and see if they pick it up and play a regular high G. Not that I've ever done that. So yeah, I mean, just
I think this isn't supposed to be competitive tricks. I think it's supposed to be tricks of being an adjudicator. You know, not like how do you disguise your performance.
Oh.
It's supposed to be more like if you see people who are, for instance, Tom Foley has, for large numbers, he has that little cheat sheet, as if you want to call it that. He has a piece of paper where he has a scale essentially, and he marks just a simple mark on the scale so that he can sort of, if you have 30 players, how can you rate them? He has a way of rating them, and rather than ordering the 30 score sheets, he has it where he can mark and then go back to player number, you know. He does it with bands, but I imagine you could have something like that for solo as well.
Sorting through a large
Old tricks
contest.
might be like when it's a windy day and your papers are blowing all over the place, you need some rocks, you know, those sorts of things that would be wise things to have on hand, so you can keep your papers together. I'd like to find out about the old trick of staying warm, sitting in a chair for 5 straight hours listening to Pete. How do you keep yourself engaged?
Yeah.
With all these, how do you get up and move around? You know, those kinds of things I think are things that would be good. One of these things, keep track of the parts as the performance progresses, is something that keeps me engaged, because sometimes when you're trying to concentrate over long periods of time, sometimes you find yourself just spacing out. And,
right.
How do you keep yourself into it and value the player who's in front of you as much as all the other players that have come before?
Keeping track of the parts, I mean, yeah, even in light music, is, you know, or in pibroch, yeah, I'll find occasionally, you know, I'll think, wait, you know, did they repeat that part, or did I blank out for a second, or what? And you can only make a comment on it if you're really sure. Yeah. And it's a tough situation, because, you know, the competitor, you know, may say, oh, well, I got away with that one. I guess that judge wasn't paying attention, you know, and so your own credibility is at stake sometimes. Yeah.
Second and the fourth part happen a lot.
Oh, switching the.
By mistake. So if you play this, sometimes you play the second part, play the fourth part for the second, or you automatically play the second at the end to transform. And if you take a judge doesn't know the tune, so that.
Never happened to me. Yeah. And you know, we're all human, so there are going to be things like that. One of the things that I think was a nightmare, would be a nightmare for me as a judge, would be to make a very, you know, factual, you know, comment that I was absolutely sure about and I was wrong. You know, you missed the second part of that tune, or, you know, and they kind of come back and say, no, you know, it's not. And that's where you know, you just want to be cautious about observation. You got to be sure. So at this point in the workshop is when we practice writing score sheets, listen to some recordings of solo competitors, and see what we can do in terms of providing feedback. For those of you at home, what we suggest is that you find some recordings of solo pipers on YouTube that may be available to you, and preferably lower grade competitors, to hear some piping that will have some opportunities for you to make comments, and practice writing up some score sheets. For the next hour, we will be covering pipe band adjudication, specifically the piping part of it. Many of the elements that we are going to talk about are very similar to the elements in judging solo piping. I'd like to cover those in briefly, and then talk some more about some of the differences in judging pipe bands. So, beginning with selection of tunes, we addressed that briefly in the solo piping. Here you have even a little bit more opportunity to consider tune selection, whether you're judging an MSR or judging a medley. So while the rules state that, what do the rules state? That the selection of tunes shall not be a factor? The setting of tunes. Setting of tunes, right. The setting of tunes should not be a factor, but the selection of tunes, and in particular, how an MSR is put together or how a medley is put together, is certainly part of the musical performance, part of the presentation. And so you're looking for creativity, balance, some logic to the tunes. Some of the elements that go into that might be, for an MSR, the length of tunes. If you play a four-parted march and then go into an eight-parted Strathspey and an eight-parted reel, you might consider it's a little bit imbalanced. Probably more common would be a six-parted march leading into those longer Strathspey and reel as well. And for any particular grade level, you might be looking at also, are the tunes that are being selected and presented, I guess, simple enough to play well, but complex enough to be challenging. You're looking for that kind of balance, similar to what you're looking for in a solo competitor. The medley is another case entirely. Any thoughts on the MSR? Other things to look for there, other than sort of the length of the tunes and the complexity of the tunes? Yeah. Okay. Usually, I mean, when a band comes out and plays an MSR, it's like you sort of accept it at face value, and oftentimes the tunes are pretty well known tunes, and the construction doesn't offer a lot of leeway. With the medley, though, that's a different case entirely, especially as you get to the higher grades, where you would be looking for not just a bunch of tunes strung together, but that musically there's some type of progression, some type of variety that's presented, and even to the point where if you look at what some of the grade 1 bands do in putting a medley together, there's at one end Toronto has done some very interesting things in sort of putting a suite of tunes together and doing a lot of composition and different things with focusing on rhythm and not so much pulling out sort of classic pipe tunes and putting them together. Another example is I think Simon Fraser University Pipe Band is a pretty good example of where they will put together medleys that have some very pleasing and dynamic kind of chord progressions or changes in key, I guess, from one tune to the next. And lately there have been medleys put together where the sort of the slow air or some element of the slow air repeats itself musically later on in the medley. So there are lots of opportunities for introducing creativity into a medley. And as a judge, I think you are looking for some of that creativity and some of the use of a variety of time signatures, keys, tempos, and sometimes you're looking for new stuff as well as some of the good old stuff too. So is the medley and the tune selection, is that fair game as far as comments that you put onto a score sheet? Yeah, Lord.
Perhaps the harmonies.
And harmonies.
Yeah, a lot of bands sometimes don't get it quite right. The harmonies, they put the piper in the wrong place, or they put too many or too few.
Yeah.
It's not always clear cut that it's working, is it?
Yeah. Yeah, there's harmonies, it's like you like to hear them, it sort of fills things up more.
Or the band playing harmonies in the corner. They should always be in the band.
Yeah, if they become too dominant, then that's something that that you might comment on. We were talking a little bit about where you stand as a judge, and that can, if bands are playing a harmony, certainly that can affect what you hear as a judge. If the harmonies are particularly from one location and you're right next to that location, it's going to sound kind of dominant. You may want to shift around a little bit in order to get sort of a better overall impression of the intended blend there. But yeah.
As far as the question of whether judging the music that's being played, that's actually a specific assignment that the ensemble judge has got. He's supposed to do that. He's supposed to judge the musical score, the way it's been put together.
Yeah, ensemble judge, yeah. And actually the piping and the drumming judges can, comment on that as well. In fact, yeah, it actually, on the band piping adjudication sheet, it actually doesn't list that specifically, but I believe that it does on the ensemble,
Yeah, it's a
the ensemble
specific
sheet.
charge to the
Yeah.
ensemble judge is the fourth component beyond the three, tone,
Right.
technique, music, and the arrangement.
Yeah,
But I think that the construction of the medley, you can't help but listen to it. And so if it has some sort of a big impact on either on the piping judge, I think that it's legit to make the comment.
yeah,
It's just they're not supposed to, perhaps they're not, their task is not to scrutinize the construction of the overall musical score as a whole, so much as to get into what the pipe corps is doing.
what the pipe corps is doing, yeah. The the March medley for grade 4, that's something where as a judge you're hoping to hear a little bit of variety. You're hoping not to hear 3, 4, 4 tunes all played one after the other. But I mean that's certainly something that can be presented by a band. Again, what can be done by a band to introduce some variety there would be a change in time signature, or a change in key, going from a tune that's a dominant, got a dominant D, low A, high A, to one maybe that's more minor key, to with the B, D, and F. And March medley. Now this is a question: do we ever hear tempo changes in March medley?
Rarely, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to slow down sometimes.
Maybe especially if they're going from one time signature to another.
Even within the same.
Even within the, no, I don't mean within the same tune.
Within the same, we're all playing 4/4s, but one tends to drag sometimes.
Oh, okay, yeah. But I mean an intended change in a March medley.
Like a 4/4 to a 6/8, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Or 2/4, 6/8's the double, triple time kind of switch.
yeah. Because in the medley at the higher grades, I mean, typically you're not going from one march to the next. There's always a little bit more abrupt sort of tempo and time signature change. If not abrupt, at least a more distinctive change. But playing 3 marches in a row. Again, bands are should look for ways to introduce some type of variety there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about tonal issues. Again, a lot of the terms that are used are the same. There are a few additional things that come through when you're playing in a band. So the concept of balance. We talked about for an individual piper, balance of the chanter, against itself, low hand, high hand. Balance of the chanter versus the drones. But now we're introducing, 8, 12, 16, 24 pipers. So what are some of the other issues of balance then when you introduce more pipers?
Well, you've got one side of the circle versus the other side of the
One
circle.
side or the other, yeah.
Make sure that there's a balanced sound all the way around, one side isn't more dominant than the other. Another thing would be with a band, you know, especially the bigger bands, you've got to be careful that one part of the instrument doesn't overwhelm the other, you know, that you're not so heavy on the drone sound, for example, like a big bass sound, such that it's distracting from the other components of that sound.
Lauren?
When the band strikes in, I think all of us can pretty much tell that they've got synthetic reeds in. Sometimes that goes against my ear. A lot of the synthetic reeds, it's like a Hoover rather than a, you know, it's not pleasing to the ear. In certain circumstances, I find, and you can, that's the balance, isn't it?
So the initial drone sound as
And then even
drones
once
are being
it
struck
goes
in. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you hear the really good grade 1 bands and, you know, good grade 2 bands too, and you know, when they strike in the drones, they're there, you know, and just not quite up to pitch because you don't have the full pressure, but there's that smoothness. And lower grade bands, you're just not going to be able to
But even
get that
high grade
roughness.
bands, sometimes it's some drone sounds I don't like personally. You can tell it's synthetic as soon as they
Just too rough at the beginning. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, you're introducing, you know, with more pipers, you're introducing more issues potentially with intonation, with blowing. You know, some people sagging a bit, some people blowing more. So, and that manifests itself also, especially bringing this idea of listening for the harmonies. Oftentimes, you can really hear, when there's a harmony, you can really hear if somebody is just not quite blowing there. I mean, if you're hitting a low A and a few people are sagging on a low A, there's going to be a little bit of, you know, roughness there, and you might not have the solid low A, but if somebody's sagging on a low A and somebody else is playing a C up to pitch, there's going to be that additional dissonance that comes in that can be a little bit grating. So so the blowing and the intonation can magnify itself quite a bit. What are some, in terms of tone, any other differences then for you know, between band piping, band judging and solo judging?
It's just the whole idea of unison comes into play within every aspect of the band, so that there has to be this effort at unison, and so it's just straight across the board.
Yeah.
So it's part of the pitch is part of the intonation, has to have the same quality of sound, like the same timbre of sound. So I think that's maybe what Lauren was hinting at in terms of sometimes the synthetic drone reeds are awful rough and they're not very well refined. They haven't sort of taken it to a refinement where it's smooth. So those kinds of things, I guess you could have the balance from side to side of the band that can, you can be talking about that in terms of the unison of the overall sound.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that in these workshops that we've had over the past few years, one of the subjects that's come up sometimes is what can a piping judge comment on? You know, the issue of the band, the whole band balance. Obviously, the ensemble judge is very much, you know, tasked with drawing some conclusions about that. But if you if the piping judge notices that the pipers are playing faster than the drummers are in a particular tune, and you can't help but notice, say, and it might be that the pipers are really rushing it. Yet if the pipe section was playing on its own, they might be playing well together, but they're not with the drum section. What can the piping judge then say about that sort of situation?
If they're rushing it, they're rushing it for you personally. So they're rushing it.
Yeah.
What if in the sense that it's a drum corps slowing down? The pipe corps is definitely holding steady. You just not, I mean, obviously it's not your job to comment on the other sections are doing. But then it's, I mean, is it a non-issue, or you say, hey, good, great holding it together here, can you know a positive thing? Even though if there is a separation, it might not be the fault of the pipe
Yeah.
core.
I think that what you can say is you can always state a fact, and you can also state something if you say that if you say something that maybe is not going into your overall ranking of the pipe section. So let's take that example where the pipe section is playing it well, but as a piping judge, you know that some problems are being introduced because the drum section is slowing down or they're not playing well. I mean, you can still put a margin note in there saying, pipe section was nice and steady. Drummers might need some work to bring it up. Or, I mean, if you hear something and you know something is going on, I think it's okay to write that down, but you should not factor that into your evaluation of the pipe section. I think that's kind of generally how we've talked about that sort of situation. That you don't just ignore it if it's something that you feel would be a helpful observation.
Yeah, and I think if you're the piping judge and you're listening to the piping, and then something happens from the percussion side that influences your listen, then I think that even though you weren't trying to listen to it, it was so significant that you could make a comment. In other words, it's to do with the integration, the intra-core integration that you're trying to listen for as a piping judge can be influenced by the other cores,
right?
Whether it's the midsection or the snare section or whatever it is. And so I think it does have an effect because obviously you are all playing together. It's not like you're just listening to exclusively. So I think I don't think you're listening to fine detail or make fine detail comments about, but if you're standing there listening and you're hearing it, then obviously the pipers are probably hearing it too, and it's causing for some kind of disintegration.
Yeah, for the most part, when I'm judging piping in a band contest, I mean, I'm just so busy trying to take in, what's going on with the pipe section that sometimes I'll just, I won't even hear what's going on in the drum section. So if you're not hearing it or if you're not listening for it, then you focus in on the pipe section. But like you said, if there's something that happens that is just so clearly affects what the pipers are doing, you want to get that in there.
An outstanding bass drummer who is mistiming somehow, and you can't not hear it. So I think that's a reasonable thing to put down something in some sort of constructive way about the integration of the pipe cores being influenced by some sort of cross-purpose input from somebody else.
Okay, so with solo piping, we talked about the introduction of the tunes. With the band, we have the attack, but it's attack, but it's also the introduction. It's a continuum. The attack is I suppose it's a remnant of military bands. 3-pace rolls, drones, E. Sometimes bands will not do an E. They'll go into something else and in a medley or something like that. But as a judge, it's probably best to not just think of the attack or the introduction ending with the E, and then that's the E, that's the introduction, then they're playing the tune. The introduction really is the attack, the E, and on into the first part of the tune. It's really a continuum. That's how the band is introducing whatever they're playing. I like to not write anything down until I've heard the first part of the first tune. So you get a sense for, some of the things that, what are some of the things you would listen for there? Obviously, drones striking in together, but the E then ends up on the beat at pitch. The tempo of the first part of the tune is the same as what was called out, as what was played in the attack. So all of those things integrate together. This handout goes through some of the elements in each of these areas that we look for in a lot more detail. So, for instance, here on the attack, are the drones struck together? Are there any drone sounds between the rolls? Are the E's hit together? Are they in tune, creating instant tone? The first several bars in unison, or the first several phrases at the same tempo as the roll in? So all of those things you're listening for in that first 10 or 15 seconds. Breaks and transitions. Again, with bands, typically, especially if you're getting into the medley, you really do have transitions. You don't necessarily have breaks from one tune to the next. But here again, you want to listen, you want to start listening as the band is leading up to that transition, listen through it, and then listen afterwards. So what are some of the things that you would listen for leading up to that break or transition? Again, blowing, tone, maintaining the tempo, or if the band is slowing down or changing, going into this whole transitional phase of changing a time signature, that sort of thing, certainly listening for unison playing there as well. And does it really does it hold together musically? And the finish. No trailing drones. Or trailing drums, I suppose. The same thing you're listening for as leading up to a break or a transition. It's so tempting, especially for the lower grade bands. It's like, oh, we're in the home stretch, and it starts going faster, and sometimes the blowing either, starts to tail off, or else people are blowing their brains out at the end and blowing too hard, and then the fingering goes a little bit. But you're listening for that clarity all the way to the end. Musicality. I think a lot of these terms and a lot of the things you're listening for are the same as what you're hearing in solo piping. Again, as you're introducing more pipers to it, you get into the whole challenge of harmonies, the use of harmonies, the overuse of harmonies. Everybody probably has a different threshold for what is just right. We had our band had some comments last year and this year about would like to hear some more harmonies, maybe early on in the medley, and I don't know that it affected the outcome of the competitions, but those sorts of comments, especially when you hear them from several different people, they're good to take home with you, because you want to try and continue to improve as a band and improve the presentation that you're making.
Okay, so some
Yeah.
of the lower grade bands that start harmonies too early. So almost the first part of the tune when doing it. I think that's too early.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, especially with the lower grade bands, there is not enough kind of acknowledgement of how important it is that the person playing harmonies is hitting the same rhythm and the same beats with the rest of the band, so that those harmonies are coming through really as chords rather than, you shouldn't be able to hear that harmony if you're putting chords together. You shouldn't be able to hear it as other than just a triad or a group of notes that are blending together. And if the person playing harmonies or the people playing harmonies aren't quite hitting the beat, it sounds a little bit mushy.
I mean, literally too early in the tune, but you shouldn't have harmonies
Yeah.
far. As well as having them at the same tempo as everyone else.
So you're saying that as a judge, you want to hear the band establish something pretty straightforward before getting too fancy.
Yeah, let me hear
Good
what
point.
you sound like before you start playing with that sound.
Mm-hmm.
Let me hear what those chanters sound like the pitch that you're at, the resonance that I'm getting, you know, is it got a nice timbre to it before you start modifying that sound with the harmonies. And if anything, I find with the lower bands, kind of follow up what Lauren's saying, is that if anything, a lot of the lower bands tend to overdo harmonies to the point where they almost get intrusive. You know, I wish they weren't doing it, so that you could hear a little bit more about what it is they're doing, and a little bit less of all the chords that are coming at you.
Yeah. As a pipe major or a person playing in a band, I would rather leave the audience or the judges wanting a little bit more. You know, it's like, oh, you give me a little bit more of that, rather than barrage them and say, you know, enough. You know, I don't want to hear any more of that. So the advice to bands would be, you know, use harmonies thoughtfully, carefully, and to not overdo it.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
What about
Steve.
the complexity of harmonies? I mean, I've heard some people try to play harmonies kind of right along with the main themes of the music,
Mhm.
and it seems to me that simpler is better in a lot of cases.
Yeah, well, you have harmony. I mean, I'm not even sure that that's sort of the right term to use. I mean, you can play harmonies, meaning, you know, play essentially the same tune, but, you know, up a couple of steps or down a couple of steps, or, you know. But then there's also counter melodies where you might have a band playing, you know, a certain tune where it may be going a little bit, the overall feel is a little bit slower, but the counter melody may be, you know, doing some other things in between. And again, that's very effective. It adds more voices to the, you know, to the chorus, if you will. But if it's not, if it's not all joined together, you know, with the beat, or it's not all blown properly, that can be even more distracting if there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on. But I think, you know, anything like that is fair game. Again, as long as it's kind of tasteful and not you know, totally in your face.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, make sure you're doing it well.
Yeah.
You know, because you're taking a little bit of a risk when you do something like that. So
Mhm.
make sure that whoever needs to execute that is comfortable in executing it properly.
How about tempos? Let's talk a little bit about that. I think, Bob, you had talked about in terms of solo piping that tempo can just be a real basic good thing to build on, or it can create a very shaky foundation for doing everything else if you're playing too fast. Same thing apply in pipe bands. And how do you decide, you know, how to make a comment on tempo? There's kind of what you're expecting as far as the tempo of a particular tune, especially something like an MSR where you know, there are, some people think there are sort of rigid, you know, beats per minute for each of the tunes. But also in terms of what the band can handle. What sort of comments on tempo would you expect to make?
I think the classic one is that in a band that doesn't have the technical proficiency to take the tempo up in a tune like a jig or a hornpipe or a reel or even a WUSPBA, that to maintain their unison and keep the technique reasonable, but they'll drop the tempo way down so they can manage it. And so they're offering a change in type of tune, but they're missing the tempo that goes with it, and so it sort of misfires a little bit in terms of offering the kind of contrast that they're hoping to get. So I think, I guess if you were making a comment about it, it's like you have to, you know, declare that the tempo you wish the tempo could be a little bit more up, But you understand why they're keeping it down to manage the technical side of it. If they up the tempo, then the technique goes out, and if they lower the tempo, then the technique is in, and they've made a choice
Yeah.
about it. And so that's their choice. And so your job as adjudicator is to how you're going to weight that choice that they had to make based on, it was a reasonable choice, and they had to make it. That's so I think if you declare what the situation is and don't attach any judgment to it in kind of a heavy-handed way,
Right.
then but you can still say that because of the choice they made, that it's still not ideal.
Yeah. Yeah, and even to yeah, you want to be careful about commenting on intent, you know, or
Yeah.
yeah. But at the same time, if you know that they're playing something more slowly, but they are playing it together, I mean, you can kind of combine a positive comment with, you know, played well together, but tempo left you know, compromised the musicality a bit. You know. So, yeah, Lauren?
It's an interesting point, just what Campbell was saying. What do you think about a band who have decided in advance that we can't go with jigs? So they finish the medley with a couple of 4/4s. And they do it nicely, and that's all well together, but playing against a band who at least tried a set of jigs, but maybe made a hash of it, how would you rate them against the other band?
What grade?
4.
Grade 4? Personally, I would probably go with the band that played the 4/4s. If you know, if they pulled them off, and they were you know, cleaner and musical, I think you can get to. I mean, you say, you know, make a hash of it. I mean, if the jigs were really did not come across well at all, and it was clear that the band really can't handle it, I think overall, taking a step back, it's still it's a musical performance. And there's not a requirement to put jigs in, and it's great that they gave them a try, but they need to they need to execute them better in order to get credit for it.
At least they tried them. You'd say at least they tried them as a medley. Quick march competition was the day before.
Yeah, but you know,
Which maybe you would weigh in variety, right, as a personal thing.
well, it also depends on what else they played in the
Yeah.
you know, in the rest of the medley too. So it's not a requirement to put jigs into a medley, you know. But if the rest of their medley was a bunch of 4/4s, then yeah, I would kind of go the other way there. But if they, you know, had played Strathspey and Reel, and maybe, you know, if they had played a 6/8 march, you know, I do like to hear a little compound time, you know.
Similar to what
So-
you're saying with the solo pipe, if somebody picks a harder tune, you look at how do you compare them? If it's clear that it's a much simplified medley, it's a hard one to me.
Yeah, there's a border. We had some of that when we had put in the rule about the quick march medley, so that if your quick march medley was a set of group of tunes, and then your medley was the same group of tunes with a slow air in the middle, how that was an unacceptable practice.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like that's the worst side of it, you know. But so one step more is you have essentially the same group of marches, but they're different tunes, and then you put a slow air in the middle of it, versus having a Strathspey and Reel, perhaps, or a jig in the middle of it. It's like how much variety do you have to kind of like be acceptable? You know, since we have no degree of difficulty factor like diving, you know, where you're trying a different thing and you get rewarded for it. We don't have that.
Yeah.
But maybe we should. I don't know. That'd be an interesting thing
Well,
to do.
in a way we do. If you were judging a couple of bands, all things being equal, and one of them had a jig or two in their medley, let's say it's a grade 4 band, and they actually did a good job of it, versus a band that did a good job of finishing off with a nice 4/4 or something like that, I'd probably give a little bit more credit to that band that's capable of playing that technically more difficult music. And at the same time, if I had a band that played jigs, and you know, we've all heard this, you know, a band comes in and for whatever reason they figure they've got to play a jig and they just blow up. you know, everything's going fine, and they've even played some nice spades and nice simple reel, and all of a sudden they try a jig and they just can't do it. Yeah, I've made comments like, well, there's no requirement to do it. Maybe you should rethink it. You know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because all they're doing is hurting themselves.
I think all of these sorts of examples, I mean, they're great to have conversations about. And it's not exactly apples and oranges, but it's, you know, you're dealing with so many different variables, and you're trying to say, well, which is more important? You know, the musical variety of a piece, or how well you play it? And you know, the answer is it depends.